All right, good morning, everyone. We're ready to go with our webinar this morning, which is part of our PowerShift program. And today we're talking about the multiple impacts of household energy efficiency and an assessment framework that's been developed by ACIL Allen. So first of all, I'd like to acknowledge the custodians of the land on which we meet, which is the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay our respects to their leaders past and present. Today we're going to start with the agenda with Kerry Connors talking a little bit about PowerShift. Those of you who are on our last webinar, that's a bit repetitive, but it'll still give you a sense of where we're going. And then we'll go into a presentation from our three ACIL Allen speakers, which are Marion Lowry, Maela Garcia, and Rita Sampora. And after they've done their presentation, we'll go to questions and answers, and we'll ask you individually if you've got questions to unmute, and then other people can be heard. Feel free to post questions as we go along on the chat line, and we'll use those as well when we go to the question and answer session. So thanks again for attending, and I'll just hand over to Kerry Connors.
Thank you, Lynn. So I'll just talk briefly about PowerShift and give you an indication of the work we've done to date and the work we're doing over the next few months. So essentially, just to give you an overview, PowerShift Agenda aims to offer practical assistance to consumers by encouraging and developing tools, information and programs that help them manage their energy. Our aim is to ensure that those products, tools and information give customers what they need when they need it. The primary focus of PowerShift is on vulnerable consumers, but we believe there are consumer insights from the evidence base that are relevant to a whole range of households. I should say too that PowerShift is funded through a grant from the Commonwealth, and part of that grant was used to support the group of Energy Efficiency Researchers Australia, which was the networks of academics and researchers that was established through the Low Income Energy Efficiency Program. Where it sits within ECA's mandate, we were established to promote the long-term interests of consumers with a focus on residential and small business customers. In order to do that, we need to understand the outcomes customers want and how they engage in this market. So underpinning that participation are the information and tools they need to help them make a decision, whether that's to stay with their current retailer or switch, how to manage their energy use to ensure they can pay the bill, or what appliances they need to buy. This is a pretty timely project. It comes at a time of rising prices with very little short-term relief. That there are technologies emerging that offer a lot of help potentially to households if they're implemented successfully, but low-income households can have difficulty accessing energy management products and tools. And state and Commonwealth governments are rolling out programs and policies addressing energy affordability, and a lot of those programs are looking specifically at energy management. So we think our research can feed directly into that work. The focus for the first few months of the project has been on identifying and communicating the customer insights and learnings of the Low Income Energy Efficiency Program projects. They were 20 pilots trialled over 3 years that tested 44 initiatives with a number of households and resulted in significant behaviour change and overall energy and reduction in average daily household consumption of between about 2 and 12%. It's a very rich evidence base, and we're finding some pretty important key findings. Critical ones are that we have better insight into how low-income households make decisions and the messages that resonate with those households. We have a better understanding of the tools and interventions that change those customers' behaviour. We focus too much on energy savings. We think the greater benefits health and well-being, and the impact on household social and economic inclusion. And those now need to be wrapped into our thinking about energy management programs. We have a solid and, almost more importantly, a really useful framework for where there's existing evidence about those impacts. And we know where there's more work to be done. Particularly there is work around how improving the energy efficiency of housing stock and appliances. That LEAP clearly found that there's no amount of information or education is going to help if your house is uninsulated or your appliances are inefficient. The research to date's fed into our 17-18 work program, and we're also establishing contact with a whole range of stakeholders, including through in industry and government. There's a lot of work underway in this area, so we're very keen to make sure that the work we do through this project adds value. So this year we're focusing on the following areas of work. First is further research to inform decision makers in government and industry. We're looking at retail market barriers to the delivery of energy management tools and products. What we're looking there is effectively to answer the question, why aren't those products and services being offered currently in this market? So that piece of research we commissioned Brattle Group to do that piece of work, to look at the experiences of other jurisdictions and make recommendations about what might need to change here. The second is to map consumer decision making. The intention there is to synthesise the learnings from recent behavioural research, including by GEAR and by CitySmart, with the ultimate aim of developing a framework that outlines how different types of consumers make decisions about energy. We're looking at building a digital platform to enable consumer groups to share information resources. That was inspired by QCOS's Switched On Communities to make maximum use of the good work that was built through those and through LEAP pilots. And we're looking at housing. We've been talking with a range of people about how best we inform policy development around housing standards. For example, looking at innovative financing mechanisms. And lastly, it's around communicating the learnings of LEAP to the health sector. We see opportunities to link to healthcare programs and budgets, recognising the role of energy to health and well-being. That could be, for example, using home care workers as a sort of a first line of defence. We're going to keep people informed through ECA's social media platforms. Please sign up to our emails if you haven't already. Thanks very much.
Okay, thanks, Kerry. And are we going to lead off with you, Marianne? All right, okay, so I'll just hand over to Marianne Lowry.
Good morning, and thank you, Lynn and Kerry, for providing us with this opportunity to present the framework that we've developed for assessing the multiple impacts of household energy efficiency. After introducing the project to you, I will hand over to my colleagues, Mayala and Arietta, who will present the framework to you in more detail. I will return at the end to discuss the key findings and next steps before we have our Q&A session. So first of all, the project background. So as we've alluded to, traditionally household energy efficiency programs have been assessed on the basis of reductions in energy usage and thereby the reduction in energy costs. In some cases, greenhouse gas emissions have also been considered. But as a result, the benefit cost ratios have often been low, and that's particularly if the reductions in the energy usage have been considered correctly. As a consequence, government-funded energy efficiency programs do tend to be limited. There's now a considerable body of evidence of the multiple impacts, both costs and benefits, associated with energy efficiency, both private and public. In particular, through the work done by the IEA and the EU, as well as the work through GEAR. Now, just one point to note, originally the project was referred to as the co-benefits, but through the project we actually changed that to refer to the multiple impacts to reflect that there are costs as well as benefits. Now, in the absence of a holistic framework for applying existing international research on these multiple impacts to the Australian context, the consideration of these impacts can be contentious. So in some of the work that we've done in the past, we've attempted to draw on some of these other impacts. And generally there's a lot of work to be done to be able to justify what we've done and why. So the ECA commissioned us to develop the framework to help identify and measure the multiple impacts of improved household energy efficiency. As we've said before, the framework was developed by drawing on the LEAP projects and the IEA and EU research in particular to develop policies, principles and procedures to assist industry and policymakers in the design and implementation of programs to promote energy efficiency, and where possible to make recommendations to inform Australian policymakers on how best to define and quantify these impacts. It is expected that this framework will be a reference source for policymakers and industry going forward. While we had hoped that the information we were compiling would be relatively comprehensive, it has identified significant gaps in the information that is available, and we're hoping that this framework can continue into the future to become more comprehensive as more information becomes available. But just to be clear that the scope of our work did not include developing new methodologies or estimates to measure the individual impacts. We were relying on the information that's currently available. So if we look at the methodology that was applied, step one was the literature review. So we reviewed national and international literature with a particular focus on the impacts that were beyond energy savings. There's a lot of information on the energy savings, much less information on those other impacts, and that's what we were seeking to draw on. And in particular, we drew on the in-depth research on the LEAP projects undertaken by GEAR Australia, which Kerry referred to a moment ago, as well as I said before, the work by IEA, the EU, and also by the New South Wales Office of Environment and Heritage. We then had consultations with key stakeholders on the impacts and the existing evidence. And through those consultations, we identified some additional sources of information to review. And those fed then into the development of the evaluation principles and the framework for assessing those impacts. We went back to consult with the same key stakeholders on those principles and framework. And through that consultation, we continued to refine the principles and the framework to provide it in a comprehensive way that was readily understood, and very importantly, that it was readily usable moving forward. So then if we look at the multiple impacts of energy efficiency, our literature review identified 4 broad categories of impacts associated with energy efficiency initiatives. The first one, which we know the most about, is the energy system. Although through the energy system we captured a number of impacts, and it was the energy savings component of that that is most referenced in cost-benefit analyses to date. There were also the health and well-being, other participant benefits, and the overall economy. And the full value of energy efficiency to society and individuals may include some or all of these impacts. So the full suite of potential impacts should be considered holistically rather than focusing only on energy savings. Now, there are some dependencies and trade-offs between those different impacts. And so I'll now hand over to Rieta, who will go through those in more detail.
Thank you, Marianne. So once we had identified all the possible co-impacts through our literature review and the stakeholder consultations, we developed a logic map which shows the causal link between the impacts and also the strength of the evidence base supporting each impact. And in our report, this is presented as a single diagram. So it flows through from the intervention itself to different levels of household impacts, to the energy system, and finally to look at the overall societal impact. And the logic map also captures interactions and interrelations between the various impacts. And these are also described in more detail in our report. However, for today, we've broken down this big logic map into 4 individual snapshots covering those 4 areas that Marianne identified, and these each capture a discrete part of the system. As I go through it, I'll try and draw some of the interlinkages and dependencies for you, but I really would recommend looking at that full picture to get the holistic overview. So starting with the energy system, this segment of the logic map, as Marianne already mentioned, captures by and large those co-impacts that have already traditionally been taken into account when assessing the effect of energy efficiency policies and programs. So these flow from the reduction in energy consumption at the household level. And if I can just jump through to the bottom of the diagram, at the societal level, they get counted as the reduction in CO2 emissions, avoided health costs related to air pollution from electricity generation, the avoided generation cost, and deferred network investment. So in addition to these sort of quote-unquote standard benefits, the logic map identifies the revenue loss that is incurred by utilities that results from the lower energy consumption. So basically from the fact that they're able to sell less stuff to consumers. This is particularly significant where government may also be an owner of the utilities. On the flip side, energy retailers may also benefit from reduced arrears and disconnection costs, particularly if the intervention is targeted at households struggling with bill pressure. So next, let's look at the impacts associated with health and well-being. Here we have 3 exposure factors through which the impacts can manifest. So to the left of the diagram, we again have the reduction in energy consumption and the resulting bill savings. This can lead to a reduction in financial stress for households, which can then flow on as a reduction in disconnection costs at the household level. And here we're not just including the financial cost of reconnecting back into the grid, but also some of the intangible impacts, such as food spoiled if your fridge has been turned off for a week, which may be significant for a budget-constrained vulnerable household. There's also the potential for improved diet if the money saved on energy bills is spent on buying more healthy and nutritious food. However, probably the most important flow-on effect from a reduction in financial stress is an improvement in mental well-being. Moving on to look at our second exposure factor, which is improved thermal comfort. So basically heating the home to a comfortable temperature, being neither too cold nor too hot. This can lead to reduction in family tensions and social isolation, particularly in colder climates if you're able to heat more rooms of the home, not be cramped into one single room as a family, or if you feel comfortable inviting guests over to your home heated to a warmer standard. There can also be a reduction in mortality rates and an improvement in physical health from having the home heated to a healthy temperature. And our final exposure factor is a reduction in damp and mold, which can also result from energy efficiency measures such as improved insulation or improved heating. And this can also lead to an improvement in physical health. And of course, from improved health, we can observe potentially reduced private healthcare spending, and there's also a potential for fewer days lost with time taken off work or school. So, as well as the health and well-being impacts, we identified a few other categories of participant benefits that were discussed in the literature. So there's improved knowledge of energy efficiency behaviors, and oh, my apologies, I had pressed the wrong button on the mouse. Now you have the correct picture. So we have some other participant impacts that we identified as well. So here in particular, what has come through the literature is an improvement in energy efficiency, in knowledge of energy efficiency behaviors and strategies, increased empowerment and self-efficacy in implementing energy efficiency at the home, and also improved positive attitude towards energy efficiency. A final participant benefit that can occur is an increase in property values, which can be observed both at the point of sale and lease. And finally, let's look at the overall economic impact of energy efficiency. So here, it can result in improved public budgets through a reduction in public health spending, and this of course flows on from the improved health outcomes that may be observed. There's also the potential for reduced expenditure on energy concessions, particularly among the vulnerable cohorts if they are targeted by the intervention. And also potentially a reduction in human services and justice spending, which could conceivably arise from the improved mental well-being and reduced family tension impacts that we talked about just a few moments ago. And finally, there are some macroeconomic impacts that can also be observed in terms of economic output and increased employment. And now I'm going to hand over to my colleague Mayela, who is going to talk about the principles that we developed for assessing these multiple impacts.
Thanks, Rachel. Oh, I did the same, sorry. So one of the things that we wanted to do as part of this research was to develop a series of principles, core principles that would underpin the framework that need to be applied when assessing, or should be, or would like them to be applied when assessing the multiple impacts of energy efficiency. Now, these principles were developed based on what we found in the literature and also based on best practice regulatory guidelines, of which many exist in different jurisdictions. So there's a Commonwealth one, New South Wales has their own guidelines, and also with input from stakeholders. Now, the principles that you see in this slide have been presented slightly different to what you saw in the report, just to line up with the slides that are going to be presented later on, but they're basically the same. The principles are bold in the text are the ones that appear in the summary tables that we will go through in the following slide. So if I run them quickly through, the first principle that we set up was about having the evidence of a causal link between the intervention and the impact that you're trying to assess. That is, you should be able to identify a logical pathway through which the energy efficiency measure you're trying to assess would result in that impact. The second principle is about the materiality of that impact, and that is, try to consider the effort you spend quantifying or assessing each impact with respect to the respected materiality. So don't go and spend a lot of time in an impact that might just be minor for that intervention that you're assessing. The third one was about assessing the impacts with consistency with public and corporate objectives. That is, for instance, if you are trying to place a value on emissions avoided, you should be consistent with the value that either that jurisdiction places on those emissions or that business places on those emissions. The next one was about being comprehensive, and that is to at least identify all the multiple impacts that your intervention might have. The fifth one is about being consistent with what is existing in terms of frameworks. For instance, if you are doing an assessment in New South Wales, try to look at the guides, like the cost-benefit analysis guide for the New South Wales better regulation guideline, etc. The next one is quantification. And the recommendation in there is, to the extent possible and subject to the impact being material, try to quantify it. But if you can't quantify all of the impacts, at least assess them qualitatively. That's better than ignoring that they exist. The next category, if you want, is about robust methodologies. And to have a robust methodology, there's a series of principles that we recommend to consider. The first one is treat each impact individually. That is, use an appropriate methodology for each one of those and appropriate data for each one of those if you can. The next one is to try to estimate impacts that are fit for purpose. So with the objective of your assessment in mind. So try to think if it's going to be an initial estimate versus an estimate that needs to go into a cost-benefit analysis underpinning a regulatory impact statement or a business case. The last one of the principles of a robust methodology is really to be transparent about the methodology you use, the data you use, and of course of any drawbacks that your methodology might have. Then we try to talk about estimates in particular rather than just methodology. So when you're developing estimates of any particular impact, one of the things that we recommend you consider is the principle of symmetry. And that means not only look at the benefits, but also at the cost of the intervention so that any trade-offs are taken into account and you come out with a net impact. The next one is about avoiding double counting. So one of the issues with the impacts of energy efficiency is that they're not always distinct and independent, they're correlated. So really you should try to avoid double counting by, for instance, avoiding overlaps or gaps between values obtained through different assessment methods, or considering interactions between different policies which tackle the same issue. So you don't, I guess, give a value to an intervention that is in fact a result of two or more interventions. And the last one is really about, in terms of avoiding double counting, is to not include transfer or distributional impacts as benefits. The next one is about considering the rebound effect, and we probably all have heard about it, but that is energy savings might not materialize after your policy because energy users increase their consumption of energy either through an increase in use of services or an increase in expenditure on energy consuming activities, or just simply by increased economic activities. So the idea is to always consider that there is a rebound effect, or there could be a rebound effect, and consider it when assessing the net impact of that measure. The next one, and this is one that we frequently see in analysis, is about measuring marginal impacts that are specifically associated with the energy efficiency measure, not average impacts which refer to a larger population. The next one is, and we go back into the distributional impacts, is you can consider the distribution and the incidence of impacts, and that's particularly relevant when you're looking at different cohorts of people you are affecting with your intervention. However, you must make sure that you don't include them as benefits, so that you have a net societal benefit as part of your assessment. And finally, we try to provide a hierarchy about, when you have an estimate or you try to come up with an estimate, how you go about it. So that's the robustness and transferability of estimates principle, which is really about, if you have robust estimates that are available, that are specific to the circumstances you are assessing or that energy efficiency measure in that jurisdiction, use them. Fantastic. Now, if you don't have estimates that are from similar circumstances or for that specific circumstance, but you have estimates that could be similar in terms of the type of intervention or a similar climate zone, for instance, you could apply those, but conservatively. If there is not such estimate, really, the recommendation is to try to come up with some specific estimates for that intervention, and hopefully, if the sufficient estimates are done in that way, we can then later add them onto the knowledge base and could be used subsequently by other jurisdictions or for other programs. Now, if that is not possible, then again, don't ignore the impact, try to at least acknowledge it and assess it qualitatively. Now, the next slide. So after developing that set of principles that really underpins the framework, we went to develop the framework. And the first part of the first element of the framework was really what Retta went through in terms of identifying all the impacts that might come out from an energy efficient measure or program and their relationships. And then the development of that logic map. After we did that, then we thought that an important element of the framework was to establish the use of those assessments. And broadly speaking, we came up with 3 main purposes or uses for those assessments. The first one is for policy development and design, where the assessment of the multiple impacts of energy efficiency can be an input that is valuable for an ex-ante or ex-post cost-benefit analysis as part of your process of developing or designing a policy. The second use is for program evaluation, where the assessment of these impacts can be an input into an evaluation assessing the outcomes achieved by a program. The impacts might be directly linked to the objective of the intervention and then provide information about the causal pathway from outputs to outcomes to impacts, or help even to explore unintended consequences. So if you follow that map, you might be able to identify things that you didn't think of at the beginning. In addition, of course, you could use those impacts as part of an economic evaluation in the form of an ex-post cost-benefit analysis. And finally, we thought this assessment could be used as part of an industry program. So for instance, where, say, a retailer is trying to put a case for a program being considered to support corporate social responsibility programs, the inclusion of all the impacts of that potential program might make a difference in terms of whether it goes ahead or not. Another element of the framework was really to include recommendations and discussion about issues that are cross-cutting, which applied to when quantifying many, if not all, of the impacts of an energy efficiency measure. Some of these considerations link back to the principles we just discussed, and there's basically 3 really. The first is the use of social research protocols and methods, and the recommendations in there, and there's more detail clearly in the report, but is to consider and document all the contextual factors that can affect prevalence and magnitude of impacts. For instance, the climate zone, which is a big ticket item, to only really use estimates from comparable programs. And when you're estimating or starting with a new methodology or trying to estimate an impact that hasn't been assessed before, to use best practice social research protocols when doing it. Now, one of the things in particular to raise in here is the production of a baseline before you go into designing a program, for instance. There's no way of going back, turning back the clock. So always think about how you're gonna then evaluate your measures. The next one is about this issue of benefits that are intangible, or when it's hard to measure things that are not in the market. Now, this is challenging. It's always been challenging, and they generally consider qualitatively. However, lately there are many approaches that have been developed to measure this impact. Some of those are revealed preferences, stated preferences, using benefit transfer, which is using proxies, and then a new one, which is the life satisfaction approach. Now, the recommendation is there is to be mindful that these are quite challenging and time-consuming methodologies that you could use, so be mindful when applying them, but also that this is an area that is changing very rapidly. So whenever you're trying to value intangible benefits, consider new approaches. And the last one is really about the use of discount rates. There is a extensive debate about the basis and selection of appropriate discount rates. There's many different views in Australia and overseas, but in Australia, the preferred approach is to use discount rate that is based on market-based interest, rather than the government-based long-term bond rates. The most commonly used central discount rate is 7%, and sensitivity is typically between 10, 3, or 4%. However, jurisdictional variations exist. So again, taking you back to the principles, whenever you're doing an assessment, have consideration to the jurisdiction where you're doing it and to the existing frameworks. And finally, I guess, it's really after doing all that, the final element of the framework was a detailed stock take of current knowledge. The categories in that slide are the categories we use for the stock take, and not all of them are provided in the summary slide, but they're all in the report with detailed information about it. And now Retta will take us through a few of those.
Well, thank you, Mayela. Yes, I'm going to do a quick whistle-stop tour now of 19 tables in total that we have in the report. So there's pretty much one table for each impact, which covers those 9 headings that Mayela showed to you just a moment ago. For this presentation, we're focusing on just 5 elements. So we're looking at the evidence of the causal link. So is there a sound theoretical foundation for the impact? We look at the materiality of the impact. So how sizable is it? Whether there are robust methodologies and research protocols that exist for measuring this impact. Whether there are robust estimates, so whether there are actually studies that have used these best practice research protocols from which we could draw estimates. And finally, we look at the transferability of estimates from the existing studies to an Australian context. So we've summarized all that text that we have in the tables in the report as a 3-tick system. So basically 1 tick signals that there's the least strong evidence, and 3 ticks signals that there's basically the most strong evidence. And as you can imagine, we've graphically summarized quite a lot of information. So these ticks are not a representation of, for example, quantitative differences in the materiality between the various impacts. It's more just a graphical representation. So if we begin by looking at the energy system again, and as Marianne mentioned at the beginning of this webinar, this is the area where assessment of energy efficiency programs and policy has traditionally been focused. So it's not surprising at all that we get quite a few of the cells that have 3 ticks indicating that, yes, we have good evidence, we know that this is a pretty material impact, we have robust methodologies and robust estimates. And this is, of course, particularly the case for the reduction in energy consumption itself, the flow-on impact for utilities in terms of their reduced revenue, and the societal impacts in terms of reduced CO2 emissions, avoided generation cost, and deferred network investment. In the area of avoided health costs from air pollution, that evidence base is not quite as well developed yet, but my understanding is that there is work underway to bolster the current evidence base. In terms of transferring any of these estimates, it's very important to take into account the contextual factors, such as looking at, are you in a comparable climate zone? Are the dwelling types comparable? Are the demographic characteristics of the population that you're targeting similar? And of course, very importantly, are you implementing similar energy efficiency measures to the ones that were used in the studies that you are planning to draw from? And then finally, looking at the cell in the row in the light purple, the lower retailer costs from arrears and disconnections. So for this impact, it's something that has been studied particularly in the US, but it's not been really looked at in Australia yet. And it's something that you could expect to see with interventions that target cohorts that are experiencing extreme bill pressure and really are struggling to pay their energy bills and are getting affected by disconnection rates. However, because of this differences in socioeconomic characteristics, the way the energy markets operate, disconnection rates, and a range of other contextual factors, at this point in time, it is not recommended to transfer estimates from those US studies. Then moving on to look at the health and well-being impacts, we've split this one into two tables. So first off, we have the reduction in financial stress, which is one of the most important co-impacts and is thought to be an important driver of other household benefits. So there's been quite a lot of thinking that has been done sort of at a theoretical level, making the connection from energy efficiency to reduced financial stress to the other potential impacts. However, to date, there have not yet been robust methodologies developed, and there are no estimates that could be transferred to an Australian context. The reduction in financial stress can also lead to reduced disconnection costs for households and improvements in diet if money saved is spent on healthier and more nutritious food. These impacts are really something that have been identified in the literature as potential flow-on benefits, but they haven't really been studied very well. So here again, we don't have any estimates that we could draw on to transfer for Australian studies. But perhaps the most important flow-on effect from that reduction in financial stress is an improvement in mental well-being. And we have quite a few studies that do establish a link between energy efficiency measures and improved mental well-being. However, there have been a few studies that have investigated this issue and didn't find that there was a link. There are also a number of established survey instruments that have been used. However, there's almost a case that there's too many instruments to draw from. So you find that different studies tend to have used different measures and different metrics. So therefore, there isn't a whole lot of coherence between and comparability between the studies to date. And the most robust studies that have been undertaken have been done in the UK, New Zealand, and Europe. And again, we would urge to exercise quite a bit of caution if you are considering on drawing on these studies in an Australian context, because again, socioeconomic characteristics, housing stocks, different types of interventions, and all of those vary. So you do have to be quite careful that you are comparing apples with apples. Then on our next slide, we have improved thermal comfort, which is one of the key exposure factors leading on to other downstream benefits. And there's, of course, sort of quite a strong understanding that energy efficiency would lead to warmer, more comfortable homes, and an understanding that this can be quite a sizable impact. However, quite interestingly, oftentimes studies might not actually take physical measurements of the temperature in the home, and this can be a bit of a weak point in actually understanding the linkages between the intervention itself and some of the downstream impacts that you may or may not observe. There have also been some studies that have monetized the benefit of improved thermal comfort, but these methodologies can't yet be regarded to be really robust. And what we would say here is that if you do attempt monetization, you would need to take very good care just to isolate the thermal comfort component of the impact and to avoid overlap with the other downstream impacts that could result from a warmer home. Then moving on, reduction in damp and mold is another one of our exposure factors, and there are quite sound theoretical underpinnings linking energy efficiency with this impact. However, the literature also cautions that badly designed energy efficiency interventions can actually create or worsen dampness and mold problems. And the extent to which this is a dampness and mold is a problem varies quite a bit depending on location and tends to be more significant in cold climates. However, while there's been quite a lot of theoretical thinking around this impact, it hasn't been really extensively studied in the literature yet, so we don't have any estimates that we could transfer to an Australian context. The reduction in family tensions and social isolation is, again, something that gets discussed in the literature more on a theoretical level as something that could potentially arise, particularly from improved thermal comfort. However, it's not something where we have many studies to draw on as of yet. Perhaps the most significant of the health and well-being impacts that have been recorded in the literature to date relate to reduced mortality and improved physical health. So here we actually have quite a number of studies that use quite robust methodologies, even randomized controlled trials in some cases, linking an energy efficiency intervention to reduce mortality and improve physical health. However, when transferring these estimates, it's again very important to take care that you are comparing apples with apples. So looking at climate zones, similar buildings, similar socioeconomic cohorts, and particularly in relation to reduced mortality, that impact tends to be present in populations that are already vulnerable, such as perhaps the elderly. So it's not something that you can transfer to every single energy efficiency intervention that you're contemplating. And then finally, with fewer days of school or work, that again has been reasonably well established in the literature. And again, the best practice studies that have looked at this have used sort of nearly clinical methodologies looking at them. There are some studies that have relied on self-reports, but that would not be recommended as the most robust methodology. And again, I think the caveats that I've already highlighted a few times in relation to transferability of estimates would apply here as well. So then moving on to look at the other participant benefits. An important but perhaps a little bit understudied impact is the change in knowledge, behavior, and attitudes. And this is something that gets talked about quite a bit and is of course highly dependent on the program or intervention in question, whether whether the transfer of improved knowledge is built into the program design. So it's not really something that you can readily transfer between studies. However, understanding of the changes at this level can be really important for understanding the systemic changes that can be seen further downstream with the other impacts, such as, for instance, the trade-off between bill savings and thermal comfort, and the legacy and sustainability of the intervention. So what would be good to see here for the future would be to see greater harmonization of the methodologies, the language that we use when talking about these impacts, and validated survey instruments, which would enable greater comparability between studies. And households may also benefit from an increase in property values as the result of an energy efficiency interventions. And there are quite a number of studies from different countries estimating this impact, and quite well-established methodologies using hedonic regressions, data-driven approaches. However, property price dynamics vary quite a lot between markets, and over time, so transfer between studies is not recommended. So for example, if you looked at a study from Ireland in 2009 and tried to apply that in the Sydney context today, that wouldn't really be give you an accurate reflection of the impact that energy efficiency might have on a house price. However, it is an interesting question to study, but as an economist, I have to point out that from a societal point of view, the increase in house prices is a transfer. So this is not something that you would include in a cost-benefit analysis. However, it could be useful and interesting to quantify it in its own right for other reasons. For example, if you can demonstrate that energy efficiency improvements increase the value of a house, that could be used to improve households' willingness to invest in energy efficiency. And finally, we have our public budget and macroeconomic impacts. So there's a reduction in public and private health spending that, of course, flows on from the improved health outcomes that we discussed earlier. And we do have some examples in the literature where this has been quantified, monetized, and included in a cost-benefit analysis. But again, the caveats around transferability of estimates would apply. Other public budget impacts of energy efficiency relate to reduced expenditure on energy concessions. So this could be observed particularly if the intervention is targeting vulnerable households struggling with bill pressure, and also the reduction in human services and justice spending. However, these impacts haven't really been studied in the literature at the moment, so we're not at the point yet where we can say that there is a strong link between energy efficiency and reduced public expenditure at this point. And finally, we've also identified some macroeconomic impacts, so in terms of increase in economic output and employment creation. These impacts are cross-sectoral by nature, and they tend to only be present for large-scale interventions that target more than one sector. So they're not going to be something that you would investigate for every single type of energy efficiency intervention. And it's very important to consider the impact on the net economy, on the net impact on the economy as a whole. So, for example, if you create jobs in one sector through your investment in energy efficiency, at the same time, that can result in job losses in another sector. So you need to add them together and see, has there actually been a net increase in employment for the society as a whole? Estimates between studies are not really readily transferable. The results of the studies depend on the particular policy or program that's being considered, but also importantly, structural characteristics of the economy in which we're studying, as well as the prevailing economic trends at the time. So for example, if you have an economy that is growing very strongly, there's less scope for energy efficiency to boost economic growth without crowding out other activities. Whereas if you are in a recession and economic growth is below its potential, in that case, an additional investment could provide a temporary stimulus for the economy. But because of these temporal factors and contextual factors, transferability of estimates is not really recommended. Now, I'm going to hand over to Marianne for some concluding comments.
Thank you, Mayella and Rieta. So as we've discussed today, energy efficiency initiatives have traditionally been assessed based on the energy savings alone, but there are a wide range of other impacts that could be considered, and some of these benefits could be of greater value than the energy savings. And these include in particular the improved physical health with the reduced morbidity and mortality, improved mental well-being, and the reduced financial stress, family tensions, and social isolation. Now, the research has created a useful framework, and so we've got the principles. We've gone through a full stock take of what is available at the moment. But as discussed through Rieta's section of our presentation, there's significant work that is required to be able to transfer some of the work that has been done to a specific Australian context, so that it takes into account the socio-economic factors, the climate zones, and the current characteristics of the building stock and penetration of energy efficient fixtures and appliances. And within Australia, we have lots of differences. So climate zones, we have a number of different climate zones. So research that's undertaken in one climate zone may not be applicable to another climate zone. We have very different building stock across the country and within cities themselves as well. So it's very important to be able to consider all of those differences in transferring the information that is available from elsewhere. Now, through our framework, we have identified lots of gaps in the knowledge that we have to improve the efficiency and effectiveness of energy efficiency programs. Now, given the time, I won't go through all of those in detail, but just at a high level, they're generally around developing harmonised indicators to measure impacts and developing instruments to collect robust data for these indicators. It will be no small task to build up that evidence base, but we're confident that once it has been built up, that it will be able to justify energy efficiency programs that may not be able to be justified today. And so with that, I'll pass over to Lynn for the Q&A session.
Okay, thanks everybody. Let me just click through. No, not doing that way. So as you'll see in the slides that I'm just clicking through, ACIL Allen has identified a few additional areas of research. So I'd be interested to know if anybody who's on the webinar is interested in some of those opportunities. So has anybody got some questions? So just either type in a question or unmute yourself and introduce yourself. Oh, it looks like everybody's happy with the outcome. So I suppose just for me to kick off, I think to ask Marianne, I mean, you've identified the sort of climate zone differences and all of that kind of thing, but I think if you had an unlimited budget or if there was somebody out there who had a check to write, what do you think might be the most useful thing to start thinking about in an Australian context to do some further work here?
Look, the areas that we've identified that potentially have the greatest impact are around that physical health and mental well-being. So in terms of physical health, that is going to link to particular cohorts. So that's going to have different impacts, for example, on vulnerable households generally versus vulnerable with an aged or vulnerable with health conditions. It will also link to their current circumstances. So are they living in a warm climate or a cold climate? Are they living in a household that has good insulation today versus doesn't have good insulation today? So you almost need to identify all the factors that are going to contribute to the physical health, and then do the research across each of those different segments to have a comprehensive view. So there has been some work that's been done in New Zealand around the physical health, but our understandings of that study is that the housing standards were quite different. So it's not easily transferable to Australia. The climate is probably more similar to Melbourne, so you could probably transfer that work more readily to a Victorian context, but certainly it would be very hard to, for example, transfer that to a Queensland or a Northern Territory context. So quite a bit of work there. Improved mental well-being, similarly, there's identifying the different cohorts, the different types of impacts. That one is probably less to do with some of those physical characteristics and more to do with potentially just the reduction in stress that comes about through reduced costs associated with energy. So that one you could potentially do some work more quickly that's then more transferable across the nation than the physical health, which is far more location specific.
And if I can just add to that as well, what would be very good to see is actually that sort of logic map approach mapped out systematically the various impacts at the various level that you might expect to have from your intervention. And of course, you're not going to be able to measure the system as a whole, but identifying the key impacts that you need to measure to build a holistic understanding. So looking at the change in knowledge, behaviors, and attitudes, looking at the actual change in temperatures, as well as the downstream impacts in terms of improved physical health or improved mental well-being, because that will then give you a better and more rich understanding about how the intervention actually is resulting in those downstream impacts.
Okay, thanks, Rieta. Patricia Boyce, we've got a question from you. So if you want to unmute, we'll just go to you.
Yes, I've unmuted. I'm just keen to hear what the definition of the two elements of the energy system effects, utility costs from reduced energy consumption and avoided generation costs. I'm just keen to understand how they're defined.
Okay, the utility costs from reduced energy consumption was introduced as part of our stakeholder consultation. So it was, the example that was used, for example, is if a government owns the utilities and invests in energy efficiency initiatives, then the dividends that come back to government may reduce as a consequence. And so therefore, when government is looking about investing in that energy efficiency initiative, they need to consider both the costs to them in terms of the cost of the program itself, and then the additional costs through reduced dividends associated with that measure. In terms of the avoided generation costs, that obviously relates to the particular generation that would be avoided by the energy efficiency initiative. So that if, for example, there's reduced fuel costs, then that would be, in effect, a societal benefit.
So I'm just, it hadn't occurred to me that we were only dealing with the profit or the transfer back to the shareholder foregone in the utility cost one, but it seems in both cases to me that if, to the extent that we value the customer's savings at the price that they would pay for the marginal unit of consumption, then these elements of the composition of the cost have already been counted.
With the energy system impacts, this is an area where there's been, I suppose, historically an overstatement of the benefits. So historically, it's looked at just an avoidance of the retail cost to the customer. That is a distributional impact because that is the benefit to that particular customer, but it does not necessarily flow into equal benefits across the energy system itself. So it's looking at very carefully what costs are actually avoided by that action. So, for example, with the network costs, which are a considerable portion of a retail bill, most of those costs are fixed. And so if a particular customer reduces their energy use, it's not going to reduce those fixed costs in the short term. So we've identified, for example,
the spillover. I can accept that that there are spillover effects, although it's difficult to see them in the taxonomy law you have. That's why I asked for definitions of these two elements, because I could see, for example, that as with solar panel installation, there is a spillover effect to the rest of the connected population in terms of the cost, the way in which fixed costs, which have been incurred, are now spread differently across that group. But I don't see a spillover effect here. What I do see is avoided generation costs, just as you've just described them, as a positive, although with generators, I would expect there to be some element, and depending on the type of generator, some significant element of fixed cost as well. So I'm just trying to understand the principle in which these particular items have been pulled out. I can completely understand the retailer disconnection, lower retailer disconnection charges, because that wouldn't typically be counted, and I'd expect that to have an impact on retailers' costs more generally. But these other two, I'm just struggling with understanding what they are and why that warrants their specific inclusion.
Patricia, it's Lynn. Listen, I think that's probably a very detailed question, and I can hear the interest in what you're saying. So is that something we can then take offline for you and perhaps
Absolutely
to have a further, more detailed discussion?
Absolutely.
That's great. All right, thanks. Kerry, do you want to ask your question?
Sure. I suppose in looking through the LEAP evidence base and some of the other projects, energy efficiency projects that have tried to capture co-benefits and other impacts, one of the things that came through very clearly was the variability in the way people defined and captured that. One of the values we saw in this framework was actually developing a common lexicon around those impacts. And I just thought you might like to talk a little bit more about the research that you did and the variability that you encountered.
Thank you, Kerry. Yes, absolutely. That was one of the main things we did when we started this process. After looking at the literature, for instance, the European studies have a different way of, for instance, defining things like empowerment of customers or improving knowledge compared to the terminology that was used in the LEAP programs. So after looking at that, what we really try to do is to provide a definition, and that's the very first thing, which didn't make it, unfortunately, the presentation of each one of the impacts, but it's clearly in the report. That's the very first box, if you want, on the way it's defined. And what we try to do by doing that is to establish that definition. And hopefully that definition will be adopted by the users of this framework going forward. Again, especially in areas which are sort of more about empowerment and knowledge and behaviors, etc., about consumers. So that's why it's taken into account, and we welcome, of course, any changes to that. And we expect, I guess, that this is a living framework in some ways. So when more evidence or feedback comes through, that it can be reflected and so that everyone refers to it and use it consistently. Yeah.
Okay, thanks for that. Reid, you've got a question, I suppose, about how this tool might be used or how work might be prioritised. So if you want to unmute and ask the question. I've just got a chat thing from Reid saying he hasn't got a mic. So look, I'll ask the question. Sorry, thanks. Essentially, Reid's saying, you know, this is a very comprehensive, holistic framework. But in that context, I suppose, who do you have a view on who or where this work or these priorities or this work should be taken forward? Essentially, who should do what? I think that's a hard question, but I'm asking it anyway.
Okay, it would be great to see this work continued given the effort that's gone in to date and just the number of gaps and the benefits that could arise from that research. I suppose what we had floated the idea of some kind of like Wikipedia where people could enter their information and then maybe once every 6 months or once every 12 months there's some moderation of the information that's been provided, and so it clearly identifies the information that has been moderated, so there is you can have a high level of assurance that it's robust. I might be throwing different parties into the ring here, but I would have thought that an energy efficiency working group that's convened across all the jurisdictions would be the ideal place, as obviously all jurisdictions can benefit, and there's a well-established energy efficiency group through the COAG process.
Okay. All right, and I'll just check. Okay, Mike, did you want to actually ask? I mean, I think your comment's really going to, I think, some of what this framework is trying to address, which is probably trying to be less subjective. But did you want to make that comment? And I'll let ACIL Allen respond. No, okay, Mike's not got Mike's. Sorry, Matthew hasn't got a mic as well. Sorry, I'm confusing myself. You can tell Christmas is coming. So again, maybe. Do you want to comment, Mieta, on the point about the framework? And I think Mike's comment was a lot of this could still be very subjective. You know, you could go through this framework. But really, what did you have in mind, I suppose, about how in developing the framework, how does this make these kinds of evaluations or policy design based on this work perhaps more robust?
Hi, Mike. So I think by existing now, this makes it less subjective in many ways, because to our knowledge, there hasn't been any report or framework that puts all that there is out there together. And of course, these things will change as new methodologies and new studies come through, you know, particularly, for instance, in terms of, intangible benefits. But I think by its existence in itself, its production, it takes away some of the subjectivity that has been out there by summarizing what has been done and how much you can use it to transfer it to Australia. So as Marianne said, this probably is the first step, and it would be ideal that it's a living, breathing document. And we know by fact that many of you are doing studies in different bits and pieces. And I think, you know, again, in trying to get less subjective into how you measure these things, having a group that collaborates and shares knowledge to not restart again and reinvent the wheel every time, you know, a policy person is trying to do something across Australia, even though it's not strictly applicable if you're doing something in Queensland. You cannot technically use it in Victoria, but even the methodology and the principles behind those evaluations are useful knowledge to everyone else. So I hope that that answers your question.
And just further to Mayella's comments, I think the articulation of the principles in the framework are really important as well. So I suppose in our journeys over probably 20 years or so of looking at various cost-benefit analyses, we've seen many mistakes commonly made when assessing energy efficiency. And so one of the important elements for us was to capture some of those elements of best practice regulation. So, for example, the avoiding double counting, I've seen that happen many times. The rebound effect. What we didn't emphasise here very much was the trade-off between the energy savings and the improvements in physical health and mental well-being. And obviously there's tremendous trade-offs there which need to be considered so that you can't just take the full benefits from both sides. Also, and I think Lynn might have made some comment as well on this, about measuring the marginal, not the average impacts. That's another mistake that we commonly see. So this provides then a useful reference so that when new people are coming into this particular policy space, hopefully this will provide a useful reference so they don't make those same mistakes that have been made before. Now, that said, often some of those mistakes work to your advantage because it makes an energy efficiency program look more attractive. But if the assessment is being done by a line agency, for example, and it's got to go to a central agency, the central agencies are going to pick up these issues. If it's got to go to like a commissioner of best practice regulation or similar, they're going to pick up those issues. So this can help ensure that a really good quality, robust assessment is done within the line agencies first.
Okay, thanks. And we've got a question from Hayley, who is, as according to my list, is from ClimateWorks, and they have a particular interest in housing and building standards in the relationship with energy. So Hayley's question is around how might you see governments using this in, and I suppose it's a follow-on from the question, from the answer you just gave, but actually thinking about it more specifically in the building standards context and how it might be used in sort of like a regulatory impact statement kind of environment or a regulatory process. I mean, I suppose it goes to how some of these things might be able to be more advanced in government. So given that we've seen very much the link between housing and housing stock and energy efficiency. So if you want to make some comments on that, that'd be helpful.
Thanks. Well, this is something that has been tried to be addressed for many years in terms of, for instance, the Australia Building Codes Board have been trying to do some studies in terms of particularly health impacts. And they have, I guess, encountered the same problems that we all have in terms of the lack of solid evidence they could use and the need to go like right to the start and produce that evidence themselves. But that is not something that has been ignored. We know for a fact that they have been trying to establish methodologies to address it. And again, I think this is an important first step on putting it out there that it has to be taken into account, number one, and then there is some methodologies out there that could be used and as a first step. And definitely now that is going beyond, I guess, the 6 stars, the higher you go in terms of the energy efficiency standards you impose, the harder it is to get a positive benefit cost ratio. So the energy savings are probably no longer going to be enough to justify additional or increased action in that sense. So it is more important now than ever to really account for all other impacts. to be able to move forward if you want the standards in terms of buildings. And it's not only about new buildings, but there's a gap in terms of what to do with existing buildings that are not required to, to fulfill the standards unless there's a major renovation. And so I think those two things are important in terms of the housing stock. And that's something that is in the minds of the regulators, but they haven't been able to do much, I guess. And we hope that this helps.
All right, well, it looks like everyone, we've reached the end of the questions. So I'd just like to thank ACIL Allen and the team particularly for the great work. I think this is a framework where its value is going to be demonstrated in how we use it, but also ECA is thinking very much about how we maintain it and how we maintain it current, which goes to the point I think that Marianne was making about how we actually keep this as a sort of live tool and a body of knowledge. So happy to take anybody's input on that or feedback on that at any time. Kerry Connors is the lead on PowerShift, so at any time if you've got comments that you want to feedback to us about this work, happy to take them. So thanks everybody. It's just a reminder as well, we have our foresighting forum in February, on the 28th of February and the 1st of March, and you're all welcome. So thank you very much.